Krill is also the primary food source for all Antarctic animals. So whales, penguins, seals, seabirds, almost everything eats krill. There's a sentence that we say that it's that in Antarctica, everything eats krill or eats something that eats krill. So all the food chains are really, really short.
While it's true that the catch limit is 1% of the total krill biomass in the southwestern Atlantic Ocean, that's an area that's about the size of Europe. However, imagine now all krill fishing just happens in Paris and London. But the denominator that you use to say, oh, it's only 1%, is the entire population of Europe. Would that be the appropriate way to say that 1% of the krill here are being taken every year? I think it's very misleading.
This is arguably the place with the highest density of great whales of anywhere on the planet. This is a crown jewel in the world of recovering oceans.
Welcome to Saving the World from Bad Ideas. I'm Mark Lynas, and I've had a few bad ideas in my time. I used to go out in the nighttime to destroy GMO crops, and I also opposed nuclear power. But then when I looked at the science, I found I got it wrong. Oops! I've learned the hard way that none of us are right all the time. So now I'm here to challenge the assumptions that we all too often take for granted, because the future depends on us getting it right. Hello and welcome to a very special episode of Saving the World from Bad Ideas. Today, I've actually got three guests for you who are together on a research vessel in the Southern Ocean near the Antarctic. So this is not your typical episode of the show. And I'm going to ask them each to introduce themselves and tell us what you do. And then we'll go on and have a conversation about some of the issues that you're working on down there in the Antarctic.
So my name is Lucia Morillo. I'm originally from Barcelona. I've done my studies in Paris. And I actually work for Sea Shepherd. I've been in Sea Shepherd for a bit more than a couple years. And I am right now the science coordinator of Sea Shepherd. So we do campaigns both in Antarctica, but also in other places of the world.
But just tell us what Sea Shepherd is, because I remember that they used to get in the way of whaling operations. And, you know, I think a lot of us are quite a fan because of just how hardcore Sea Shepherd was. What are you doing down there in the Antarctic right now?
Yeah, so we stopped doing that. Sea Shepherd has changed a lot during the years. It's an NGO that started in 1977, and since then it has changed a lot, the approach that we have, but we always try to protect the environment, protect the animals, and do so in the most effective and efficient way. So right now, the campaign that we have in Antarctica, it's mostly exposing the krill fishing fleet, but also bringing scientists, being journalists, and giving them this platform to show the world what is happening here far from sight and no one knows what's happening.
Okay, perfect. Matt.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having us all on. I really appreciate this time and opportunity to speak to your audience about the work we're doing here. My name is Matt Savoca. I'm a marine biologist. I work in California for Stanford University and the California Marine Sanctuary Foundation. And I'm one of the independent scientists that Sea Shepherd has been working with to try to use data to inform protection of this very special place where we are. Specifically, it's the South Orkney Islands. I'm sure we will talk more about that in the next 45 minutes or so. But yeah, it's been really special to bring some excellent collaborators of mine down here and to have Lucia here as the expert on the Sea Shepherd side. But it's a really special opportunity, and thanks to technology, we can have a live chat as the boat is rocking and rolling around in a storm, in one of these classic Southern Ocean storms. So it's pretty exciting on our day off that we get to do this with you, Mark. So yeah.
Fantastic. And Ted?
Yeah, hello, Mark and all. My name's Ted Cheeseman. I am just up the coast from Matt. I'm at UC Santa Cruz, a research fellow there in the Friedlander Lab. I also, previous career, led expeditions down here for a long, long time, since I was quite young. So in the last 10 years, have made a big pivot. I'm co-founded a research platform and citizen science platform called Happy Whale, which is an entity to be able to identify your whale. So somebody goes whale watching, photographs a whale, they can upload a photo to our website and we'll tell them who their whale is, both as a way to engage people in science and learn more about those whales, but also to get the data for these whales. And We've gotten a lot of data from the Antarctic. So, and globally, like in the North Pacific Ocean, we know almost every living humpback whale. Here in the Antarctic, depending on where, we know a high percentage of the humpback whales. But out here in the South Orkneys, this is an area that's become really, really of great interest to me because it's a bit off the map, or rather, I should say, kind of totally off the map. But the few encounters that we've have records of have just seen this place at the forefront of the recovery of whaling. And all of this is in the context that last century, industrial whaling took out almost every whale, like way above 90% of the whales here. So it's of great interest to me to be here, a place that I've passed by for literally decades, actually like get to spend weeks here really understanding the local whale environment, especially at a time of huge change. The whales are recovering, and yet now we're trying to push to take out more of their food through the krill fishing industry.
Indeed, and we'll get to talking about that and whether the whales that you're seeing in the Southern Ocean and you're researching are happy or not. But first of all, tell us where you are exactly. You've mentioned the South Orkneys. Where are you in a way that people might understand? And what's the current sort of sea conditions, temperature? What's it actually like outside?
Yeah.
So you're saying that not everyone knows where the South Orkney Islands are. Yeah, no surprise there. Right. So think a little bit of time scale here. Think back 40 million years. South America and Antarctica, the Antarctic Peninsula, were all one body of land, right? With a basically a stretch in between, peninsula in between. That ripped through, and a chunk of the land started moving east 40 million years ago. The furthest east of that is now the island of South Georgia, which is somewhat known because that's where Shackleton's epic self-rescue ended back 100 and some years ago. And on the way in the plate tectonics, a few pieces of land kind of fell off in what is now called the Scotia Arc. So if you look at a map of South America and Antarctica, the Antarctic Peninsula stretches north and then curves east. And there's a few dots of land as you go east from there. One is Elephant Island, where Shackleton's men overwintered while that self-rescue was going on. And then another couple hundred miles to east of there is a tiny little speck called the South Orkney Islands. That's where we are. So it's very much in the middle of, honestly, the most tempestuous ocean in the world, which, fits. Right now it's blowing sort of 35 to 50 miles an hour outside. The first actual big storm we've had here. We've had lots of good weather the last week, but now yesterday and today have been pretty darn solid. And so we're staying inside the ship today. And yeah, so basically a little island in the middle of what is for the whales quite the opposite. For humans, we look at this and we think, wow, this place is fearsome and deadly. The whales look at this as, wow, this is a place that generates lots of good food. Let's go there.
So, Matt, we just lost the connection there because you're on a ship in a storm, and
Yeah.
I might need to repeat it. So I was just asking really what the research work is that you're doing. I know it's about whales, but specifically what whales and what are you hoping to find out?
Yeah. So as Ted mentioned before, this is a very sort of remote place in Antarctica. And even folks who have been to Antarctica numerous times, like Ted, for example, don't know very much about this place in particular, the South Orkney Islands. So the South Orkney Islands have recently risen to prominence in terms of a global conservation space where folks are really starting to pay attention because it is the epicenter of recovery of the great whales following their near total extermination in the 20th century during industrial whaling. And what we've seen is after a period of about 50 or so years, so from 1970, 1980 until about 2010, researchers, tourists, et cetera, folks that came down here basically never saw any whales. But in the last 10 or so years, whales are recovering. And nowhere is that more true than in this archipelago, this group of islands in the South Atlantic sector of the Southern Ocean. So here we have humpback whales fin whales, southern right whales. We also are fairly confident there are a few Antarctic blue whales that use this region, minke whales, probably orcas. It is a really important area globally for marine mammals and for large whales specifically. Though I think recently the stars of the show have been the huge aggregations of fin whales that have occurred in this region. So fin whales are the second largest animal on Earth. They can grow up to about 80 feet long. Off the top of my head, I can't do the meter conversion. I don't know, Lucia, do you know the meter conversion?
It's 24 meters.
Yeah, I grew up to about 24. See, this is why we have a European here to be able to translate on the fly. About 24 meters in length. They can grow to be 70 or so tons. And yeah, they're the second largest animal in terms of mass ever to evolve on Earth. And there were about 500,000 of these whales in Antarctic waters at the turn of the 20th century. By 1970 or so, that was reduced to a couple thousand, maybe 10, 20,000 fin whales. So they reduced fin whales via direct hunting by about 95% in 70 years, which is approximately the lifespan of one single fin whale.
Wow.
Yeah, it is amazing. I mean, the scale of destruction of this place is really remarkable and quite saddening. But what it did is it led to the Antarctic Treaty and other conservation measures to protect this place moving forward. And since those protections have come in place, the recovery of the great whales here has been slow, but it's finally starting to accelerate. So in the last 5 or so years, researchers, the fishing industry, basically anyone who's down and spent time near the South Orkney Islands has found huge pods of fin whales. The largest seen in the 21st century are all from this region. In fact, the reason why I think we're all here is because in early 2022, so almost exactly 4 years ago, we had a colleague aboard a National Geographic Lindblad expedition ship, and they came across a pod of 1,000 fin whales. And that is by far the largest aggregation that we've seen post-whaling. So in the last 70 years, probably the largest aggregation that anyone on Earth has seen today. And these aggregations seem to be a kind of reoccurring thing in this area. So we are here to understand primarily what's going on with fin whales and fin whale recovery, as this seems to be the spot where most of it is happening, or the most accentuated area in the whole world where this species is recovering. But also it's an area that there is extreme climate stress happening, warming seas, lower ice duration and extent, and also a krill fishery that is expanding in the region. And we're interested to see how that krill fishery interacts with these recovering whales. But also, I think more broadly, we're interested in this area as a very special place, to describe it, to understand it, to promote it to the world, because regardless of whether or not there's a krill fishing industry here, this is a very exceptional place that is in serious need of real protection, because it's one of those spots in the world that can inspire and change minds as to what our oceans and what our planet is capable of if we just leave it alone, let it be, and let it recover. So that's why we're here, to study the large whales. I would say primarily fin whales, but any whales will do for us.
Lucia, maybe you're the right person to explain to us about the krill fishery, what it is, what krill are for starters, because people probably don't necessarily know that. In fact, I'll be honest, I don't think there should be any fishing going on in the Antarctic. I think we should leave it alone and let it recover from the previous horrific exploitation that Matt was just talking about in terms of industrial whaling, which also affected seals and penguins and other species too. So what's going on at the moment in terms of this krill fishery? Who's doing it, and what do you think the impacts are likely to be?
So, yeah, first of all, you're right. Like, the history of Antarctica and in the history of Antarctic exploitation has always had catastrophic consequences. It happened with seals, and then they kept hunting seals until almost extinction, and then whaling. So this has always happened in this way. And we start to think why this time would be different. So what is krill? Krill is this small crustacean. There's krill around all the world, but in Antarctica, there is Antarctic krill that is way more abundant than anywhere else in the world. Krill is also the primary food source for all Antarctic animals. So whales, penguins, seals, seabirds, almost everything eats krill. There's a sentence that we say that it's that in Antarctica, everything eats krill or eats something that eats krill. So all the food chains are really, really short. And what is happening now is that there is 5 countries, there's 12 vessels right now that are exploiting this ecosystem and they are fishing for krill. Krill fishing, we need to understand that it's not seasonal fishing, it's not out of necessity, but it's just a pure industrial operation. These vessels are not only fishing vessels, but they're also factory vessels. So they will fish at the same time that they process and produce the final product that will then be sold. It's a fishery that happens 11 out of the 12 months of the year. So they never leave these waters. And it's sustained because we have, at the same time that the fishery is fishing, there is all these reefers and tankers that what they are going to do is they will come from South America, come to the Antarctica, refuel the fishing vessels while they are on the spot, and then they will also take all the product that has been produced on board. So there is no rest. It's fishing vessels will fish and fish and fish until they reach what it's called this trigger limit quota. So the organism that governs Antarctica has decided that 620,000 tons of krill is the maximum that they can fish. They will only stop once they have reached this limit. It's what it's called Olympic-style fishery. So all the countries will come at the same time, fish as fast as possible, because once the limit is reached, then they have to stop fishing.
Ted, maybe you're a good person to talk a bit more about whales and what their life cycles are, how much krill they eat. Just give us a picture of the way that sort of whale ecology works for these different species, and then we can maybe think through the implications of the krill fishery that in terms of what they might be on the whales and the whale recovery in particular.
So these whales especially, so think of it this way, right? We removed almost all the world's whales last century, fortunately not to biological extinction, just to commercial extinction. And lucky for the whales, after such extreme exploitation, the products we were getting for the whales, which remember, this isn't, sort of a whaling we will go, Moby Dick back in the day where we were lighting cities with whale oil. This is most of the industrial fishing products, industrial whaling products were turned into like margarine, dog food, fertilizer. These weren't things that were basically essentially critical for industry or social development. And fortunately, the products that came from the whales actually were getting cheaper even while the whales were getting scarcer. So they went to commercial extinction, but there were enough left of most species that recovery began once whaling was banned. And those bans went into place at various stages, and there was some illegal whaling, but industrial whaling was basically over in the 70s and 80s. So really the recovery started in the 80s. So now we're looking, roughly 50 years past the end of whaling. And what you have is a population that began from just a few percent. So it's very skewed. You have a lot of young animals and not many older animals. And I think of it not just as numbers, but also culture. These are animals with large brains and fairly complex behavior. And there's a lot of learned feeding behavior. So if you think about a population that was removed like 6%, just 4 or 5 animals left per 100, there was a lot of knowledge that was literally lost. And in some of the cases, it's literally lost where to feed. So for South Georgia, for example, when the whalers first showed up there, the first few years of whaling were entirely within the bays of South Georgia. Those bays don't have whales because those whales that knew about those bays are gone and didn't pass it on to their next generations. But so here, what we've seen is hundreds of fin whales, hundreds of blue whales. Each of these animals, these are the largest creatures on the planet. We haven't seen any blue whales, which are the single largest, but humpback whales, blue whales, they're going to eat 2 to 5 tons of krill a day. And one reason they eat so much, of course, is because they're large. But the other is that they don't eat during their breeding season. The humpback whales, which we know the behavior of quite well, the whales we see here are mostly migrating up to Brazil, some of them up the west coast of South America, like to Ecuador, Colombia, Panama, to breed, and they won't eat for 4 months at a time. So they're basically packing on fat to carry it with them and then deliver their calves and mate. And so really amazing biology. It makes me hungry just to think about it. This animal, imagine for all the moms out there, imagine that you're nursing your baby. Your baby's growing, 35 kilos, 60, 70, 80 pounds a day. Your baby's growing an inch a day, 2 centimeters a day, while you're losing 100 kilos a day, 200 pounds a day, just to keep that energy flowing. So they have to they're completely dependent on packing on all this food here. And the dynamic that we're seeing is, okay, these whales are actively feeding, but they're literally feeding within, a rifle shot of krill fishing vessels. And each of those vessels are taking as much food on a daily basis as 100, 200, the most efficient of them, 400 or 500 whales worth of food a day. So it's structured for conflict. And we're trying to understand the dynamics of it, find out how many whales there are, their age structure. Is it, in fact, what we think we're seeing? That is, many more younger animals, a recovering population. And how does that intersect with the krill fishery?
Thanks. And in terms of the conflict, I did a report, which I think I've sent through to you, Matt, looking at some of the potential numbers in terms of the amount of krill that is being extracted by the industry. And for their 620,000 tons, it was something like 800 blue whales and hundreds of thousands of seals and potentially the entire Adelie penguin chick population 4 times over. So this is potentially having a big impact. But let's establish the context of this a bit, Matt, in terms of the recovery of the whales, because you would expect, logically, with all of the whales being removed, the krill population would have gone crazy and expanded enormously. But actually, that doesn't seem to have been the case. So explain to us about how the kind of ecological dynamics works in the Southern Ocean.
Yeah, the history of the ecosystem is really interesting. And what you mentioned, is something that we call the krill paradox, which is, paradox is just when something unexpected happens. And something really unexpected happened here in the late 20th century after whaling. And so after whaling, when we removed 2 to 3 million whales, which for most populations was well over 90% of their total population size, well, whales were, and again are, the largest, both in terms of individually, but also in terms of their population prey requirements, the largest predators of krill in this ecosystem, right? And so once we extinguished that largest predator and cut their populations down by 95%, Antarctic blue whales down by 99.8%, from 300,000 animals to less than a few thousand in about 60 years of hunting them. Well, the general paradigm in ecology, and it's not a particularly challenging thing to consider, is that when you remove the predator, presumably the prey would explode in numbers. And one thing that surprised scientists is that in the later part of the 20th century, when we expected krill to explode in numbers or the other krill predators to explode in numbers, that hasn't really happened. There's a lot of nuance around this point, which, we don't need to belabor here, but generally speaking, we expected the krill stock to boom in its productivity, to multiply to maybe levels that we'd never before seen. But in fact, in certain areas and overall, I'd say the opposite has happened, which is to say there's still a lot of krill in the Southern Ocean and around Antarctica where we are, but it's not the full explosion that we were expecting. And one of the reasons why we think that is because whales act as ecosystem engineers through, I think of a large whale, a fin whale, or a blue whale as a mobile krill processing plant. So krill are full of nutrients that they get from what they eat, which is primarily phytoplankton, but also other zooplankton as well. But those nutrients are primarily locked inside the krill bodies. They can't be used by phytoplankton, by the marine plants. And so what the whale's ecological role, or one of their ecological roles, was to ingest tons of krill per day and excrete a lot of excess nutrients that the whales, didn't need to grow their own bodies and fuel their own migrations and breeding. And that sort of recycling of energy and nutrients through the system over and over again, we think promoted the productivity of this system to peaks that were around about a century ago. But once we removed all the whales, you kind of pulled the plug on that ecological mutualism. The way I think of it is almost like a car having a dead battery. And now with the whales recovering, we're seeing that battery of that ecosystem jumpstart and hopefully the ecosystem recover as a whole. But the bigger pattern with krill and the bigger concern with krill is that krill are very, very dependent on sea ice when they're young to protect themselves from predators at those early and very sensitive stages, to eat algae that layers underneath the sea ice. And without persistent and long duration and extent of sea ice, krill populations do not do as well. They don't breed as well. They don't recruit into the adult population as well, and so on. So what scientists have seen now that we have identified that krill hasn't had this explosion that we expected after we remove the whales, we're now starting to probe why we are not seeing that. And generally speaking, the answer is climate change, right? Generally speaking, in the northernmost reaches, so around South Georgia Island that we've mentioned several times in our conversation already, South Georgia Island is kind of at the northernmost extent of this ecosystem. As a result, it's also the region where ice duration has and extent has reduced over the last 50 or so years the most. As a result, what the scientific community has documented is a near total collapse of the breeding krill stock around those northern reaches of South Georgia Island. And we see the krill population and breeding center, like where the krill lay eggs, where those eggs reproduce to make more krill, has contracted toward the South Pole, so contracted southward. We see this all the time in fish in the northern hemisphere contracting poleward, birds in the northern and southern hemispheres contracting poleward with climate change, and krill are no different. They're also contracting poleward. So in the northern parts of the Southern Ocean, krill reproduction and recruitment and population building is really diminishing. Whereas we are now in the southern part of the krill's range, we're like in one of the few remaining krill strongholds on the planet. And so this is an area where krill reproduction is still strong, krill recruitment is still strong, the population is still doing quite well, but it's a tenuous level. It's something that we can easily sort of turn the knob on climate change a little bit or turn the knob on krill fishing a little bit. And that tenuous population of krill could quickly turn in a bad way and start declining. So that's what I think we're most concerned about, is these big, broad trends. And then the moral question of, on top of that, do we need to be fishing for krill? Do we need to be adding another anthropogenic stress to this ecosystem as it's recovering, as we've identified these southern reaches as the epicenter of whale recovery and one of the last strongholds of krill in the Atlantic side of the Southern Ocean? So that's sort of a long way to say that krill is doing okay, depending on where you are, but it's very, very dependent on what's happening with the climate. And it might be the case where we're at a tipping point that we don't actually know we're about to step over in terms of krill exploitation and fishing until it's already too late. So we got to behave really carefully and really cautiously if we want to maintain krill in this ecosystem.
Lucia, I'd love to hear a bit more from the Sea Shepherd's perspective about the krill fishing industry. And in particular, we're at We Planet just doing a campaign against the Marine Stewardship Council, which is in the process of recertifying the krill fishery with its blue sustainability tick. Do you think that the krill fishery is sustainable? And talk to us about what you've seen actually out there in the ocean.
So Sea Shepherd started coming to Antarctica to face the krill fishing fleet 4 years ago. So we have done this campaign already 4 years. And at the beginning, the main goal was to expose the krill fishing fleet. Krill fishing happens in sort of two different areas. During the beginning of the year, they are in Coronation Island, the South Orkneys, where we are right now. There is no one here. They're able to fish nonstop and no one will see them. And then when the tourist season finishes in the peninsula, then they will go to the Antarctic Peninsula and fish over there. So they always use these to fish outside the view of anyone. Something that, for example, happened last year is that because there was so much ice in Coronation Island, they had to start fishing in the peninsula way earlier because they need to be fishing 11 months. And then when the cruises saw that, there was a lot of backlash because people were saying, how are you fishing in Antarctica? How are you fishing in this extremely protected environment in which all exploitation is forbidden except for the exploitation of marine living resources? So from Sea Shepherd, from the beginning, what we wanted to do is to expose the krill fishing fleet. We came the first year and we released all these never-seen images of the krill fishing fleet fishing next to humpback whales, next to fin whales in these extremely beautiful environments. And the public reacted very good because everyone was wondering how is this even possible. So we did this for 2 campaigns. And then on our 3rd campaign, we realized that we needed to push a bit forward. We had already been using the Allen case, so our vessel, as a platform for journalists and experts and people to spread the message that this was happening because no one was against it because no one knew this existed. And already last year with Carmela and Meher, that were 2 scientists that work with Matt, we started the science project and we started to try to understand what is the real impact of krill fishing into the wildlife. What is happening with whales? Because it's not only the grand scale changes. It's not only that they're taking away the food from whales. How is this affecting the whales and pregnancy rates and the overall body health? It's not only that, but it's also how these whales are starting to interact with the krill fishing fleet. And also the other way around, because things that we have been able to observe because we have been spending a month every year in Antarctica is that krill fishing vessels will use whales to detect krill swarms. They have this incredible technology. They have even small drones that they will deploy so they can find the krill swarms. But also, once they spot a pod of whales feeding, they will go over there because whales are the best
indicators.
Exactly. They're the best indicator of krill in a certain area. So we have seen krill fishing vessels spotting whales and turning towards those whales.
Well, is that sustainable? That's the question. Should the MSC be giving its blue tick to this style of fishing?
From Sea Shepherd, we have a very clear opinion that the answer is no. There is no way. And once you have seen krill fishing vessels being 1 meter away from whales following the nets of a krill fishing vessel, because we still don't know the reason, but swimming around the nets over and over for hours and hours. Once you see huge tankers, reefers, krill fishing vessels, all in Antarctica, for us, there is no debate. This is not sustainable. What happens with MSC, their certifications, which reasons do they need to say that it's sustainable? It's just completely biased because the krill fishing fleet will say, we will only fish 1% of the overall krill that there is in Antarctica. But what we're seeing is that this fishing happens in exactly the same places where whales are, where penguins are. And if there's a wildlife hotspot of feeding, it's because that's the place they need. And that's where there's going to be more krill. And that's where the krill fishing fleet is going to be. So there cannot be sustainable even if it's 1%, it's the 1% that the whales need.
Right. And who's actually responsible? I don't mind who answers this question, whoever's best positioned really, but who's responsible for deciding what level of krill fishing is permitted and which countries should be able to take as much catch as they like?
Yeah, so there are a bunch of fisheries biologists that are, contracted to do this type of work to estimate what is the amount of krill that can be reasonably removed from the population and have the krill population recover or not affect the krill population in any significant way moving forward. And I think that gets to this nuanced definition of sustainability, or this is really what the conversation is about. So your question, perhaps listeners might believe that is the question of, is krill fishing or any particular activity, is it sustainable? Is that a black and white answer? Is that an objective fact? No, it's actually a pretty nuanced. There's a lot of gray in the world of sustainability, right? And the way that this applies to our system here is that for a single stock associated measure of sustainability where the only metric that matters, if you're just considering the stock itself, the exploited stock, the question of is the fishery sustainable is the fishery harvesting, and this is true of any fishery, not just the krill fishery, is the fishery harvesting the biomass, so fish or krill in this case, to the point where it would negatively affect the krill population moving forward? And the answer is no. We have not seen any evidence to suggest that the level of krill fishing that is happening is actually going to drive the krill population, for example, toward extinction. However, there's a different definition of a sustainability, what we think of as ecosystem level sustainability, right? Where you actually have to take into account the biological and ecological relationships of how important the krill are to all the predators and the ecosystem that make this place very, very special. And that's where I think the fact that the way this fishery operates, which is to say incredibly intensely at very specific locations, which also happen to be wildlife hotspots, as Lucia mentioned, and you start to think about sustainability from an ecosystem level lens, that's where perhaps this system and this fishery is not very sustainable, or that's what we're trying to sort of nail down nuance on, use data, use evidence to sort of ask the question or the hypothesis of whether or not this fishery is sustainable at an ecosystem level. Because while it's true that the catch limit is 1% of the total krill biomass in the southwestern Atlantic Ocean, that's an area that's about the size of Europe. However, imagine now all krill fishing just happens in Paris and London, but the denominator that you use to say, oh, it's only 1%, is the entire population of Europe. Would that be the appropriate way to say that 1% of the krill here are being taken every year? I think it's very misleading, even though if you say it in and you explain the logic behind it, it might be factually true, but at ecologically relevant scales. So that is to say, the scales that are relevant for penguins as they're raising chicks, the scale that is relevant for whales as they're putting on layers of blubber that will sustain them through the next year. If the fishery is taking the most important 1% in the most important places, then I think the question of ecosystem sustainability of this fishery is very much into question. In addition to that, we've seen the deterioration of conservation measures that try to spread out the catch or try to essentially allow the system to either recover or remain resilient in the face of climate change and other pressures. And the way that the fishery is operating might exacerbate these climate-driven changes or other issues in the ecosystem. And so we think that this is the area of sustainability of the broad question that you ask, is this fishery sustainable? And a single stock way, if you just fully put the blinders on and just consider the krill population, yes, and that's what the fishery, that's what the fishery touts. But if you're interested in sustaining whale populations, in sustaining penguin populations, in a robust Antarctic ecosystem, then I think that is more of a question of whether or not the system is sustainable, particularly as we've seen the deterioration of any sort of measures to make krill fishing more sustainable. Those things are just not being able to pass right now in Antarctic governance, and there's various political reasons for that, which we can get into if you want. But the point is that I think it's functionally more than 1%, because in the regions of interest, the denominator is not 62 million tons of krill. It's something far, far lower. And we can all fish now, or these companies and countries can all fish in just one specific area. And that's more or less what they do. They fish in a couple areas in the Antarctic Peninsula and in the South Orkney Islands where we are now. And that's the only place where they fish. A little bit in South Georgia in the middle of winter, but generally speaking, all the krill fishing happens here. So I think we need to think carefully about what that means when the fishery says they take 1%. And even if they do just take 1%, what if it's the most valuable 1% to the ecosystem? The impact is probably more than 1%. And that's what we need to think about carefully. And that's why recently, as of a couple days ago, other NGOs, other organizations have actually objected to the recertification of the krill fishery by MSC. And those are, organizations that have a lot of name cachet and a lot of respect. The Antarctic Southern Ocean Coalition and the World WWF, the Worldwide Fund for Nature. So yeah, I think this is an issue that now, because of folks like Lucia and the Sea Shepherd team really sort of bringing this issue to light, is now allowing the world to ask the question that you asked, Mark, which is to say, is this sustainable? Is this the type of Southern Ocean and Antarctica that we want? Maybe not. And at the very least, we should have an informed conversation about it. So that's why I'm really grateful for the Sea Shepherd folks to let us collect this information so we can answer your question more objectively in the coming months and years.
Yeah, we've run a campaign on it at We Planet as well, and we've facilitated 1,600 people sending emails of objections to the MSC saying they don't believe that this should be recertified as sustainable. Interestingly, the main company that takes the krill, which is called Aker Biomarine and Aker Krill, they seem to have renamed and split up and things, but basically it's these Norwegian companies which make a big show of being sustainable, and their CEO will bang on for hours about how sustainable they are. But the reality is that the impacts which you've seen absolutely at first hand are potentially quite profound on these recovering ecosystems. And I think it's something that people really care about. And I wouldn't normally do this on the show, but I would say to people, there are ways in which you can actually help by not buying krill products. You can not buy omega-3 health supplements, which are krill derived. There's algal alternatives out there on the market, which are price competitive and easy to obtain from everywhere. And several retailers are now around the world beginning to get krill products off their shelves. It also gets into pet food, which is some way that people may also be able to track it, and into farmed salmon. So there's feed that goes into salmon, of course, to help raise them. And so you may be recycling krill into farmed salmon if you're eating that. And I looked into this a bit, and the fish farming industry has its own sustainability certification via the Aquaculture Stewardship Council. And if you look at the ASC, it says, well, the MSC blue tick is all that matters in terms of where the actual wild fish comes from that we're feeding into the farm fish. So the MSC thing is really critical. And Ted, maybe you can talk to us a bit more about this as well. Tell us, I think people do care a lot about the Antarctic. Most of us haven't been there. We've seen it on the Attenborough film, which also had some incredible footage of the...
Yeah, that's right here. That's right here.
Wow, yeah, and there was scenes of these trawlers going right through pods of fin whales. I think they probably were.
Yeah.
Ted, tell us a bit more about why we might care about this. And it's not just whales, is it? There's all of these other different species as well.
There's a special thing going on here right now. I mean, to me, honestly, the rewilding, the recovery of this population is one of the most beautiful bits of rewilding of our planet, right? Most environmental news tends to be bad news, unfortunately. But in this case, and it's a treat for me as a whale biologist to study species where the future in many ways is looking quite a bit brighter than last century, right? It's sort of a very basic conservation lesson. If you want something to thrive, stop killing it, right? Start there, which is what we did 50 years ago as we stopped industrial whaling. Yeah, yes, you say there is some whaling now, but it's tiny by comparison, absolutely tiny. And yet now these whales are recovering into different oceans than the ones they were hunted out of. So to me, I did my PhD and focused on humpback whales in the North Pacific, and the surprising discovery, the main impact of the work was uncovering the fact that during the largest marine heat wave ever documented, this was 2014 to 2016, we ended up calling it the blob. It was broadly referred to across fishing and sort of all folks concerned with the Northeast Pacific. About a third of Hawaii's humpback whales actually died, we think primarily of starvation, because their food was just not available. It was also deeper and more dispersed, right? So these animals, they, in the right conditions, thrive. But so there's this resiliency, right? Which is what we saw after the whaling ended. But there's also a sensitivity to an environment that can support them. And so what is going on here is climate change, right? We're not individually empowered to really affect that, right? We need our governments to take lead on that, or broadly us as a people to demand that our governments do so. But here we're adding on this krill fishery that is, so I've worked a lot on the Antarctic Peninsula, and I've seen the rare case where krill fishing vessels are coming into the peninsula and being seen by tourists, and it creates a furor. I mean, there's a sense of the sacredness of Antarctica, and I think it's a fantastic thing. It's a bit like turning and saying, "Oh gosh, we need some marble. Let's go mine the floor of the Sistine Chapel." If a krill fishing vessel is there in the beautiful Antarctic Peninsula, scenic and all this. To me, a whale here in the South Orkney Islands is just as valuable, just as meaningful, just as worthy, and yet it's a very out of sight, out of mind thing. So our work is in no small way, aimed. I mean, there's an objectivity to our science. We want to just understand the mechanics of the place, but there's also an activism side of it, which is we want to put this place on the map, and we want the world to recognize that this is, in our opinion at least, and we believe the numbers will support it, what we've seen in the first about, little more than a third of our time here.
Yes.
This is arguably the place with the highest density of great whales of anywhere on the planet. And so we need to recognize this sort of critical, important habitat. This is a crown jewel in the world of recovering oceans. And so when we see a krill vessel taking, or rather a fleet of krill vessels taking more food out of this ocean than all the whales here combined could possibly eat, and those krill fishing vessels aren't, giving back, as it were. I mean, that's a sort of a soft and squishy concept, right? But these whales literally let's talk about whale poop, right?
You saw it the other day.
Yes, we did. We were zodiacking out. We were in our little boat working to get little DNA samples, and we passed by this big orange patch in the ocean, and that is literally fertilizer. This whole what Matt was talking about of the krill paradox. Remarkably, when the whales went away, the action of the whales eating the krill, pooping out the remains, fertilizing the ocean, feeding the phytoplankton that feed the krill, it's easy to think about it. Oh, the whales were gone, the krill predators were gone. So then suddenly, the krill must have expanded and exploded, right? Much as if the wolves are gone, there'll be a lot more deer or elk or something, right? But think of a different analogy. Let's say you took out the farmers. 10 years later, you go back and do you expect those fields to be growing as much crops without farmers there? Not so much, right? No, the whales aren't consciously and actively farming these oceans, but their presence in this ecosystem literally does that, where when they were away, when they were removed, the mechanism by which the krill's food, the phytoplankton, was delivered nutrients, a big piece of that was suddenly gone, and so krill populations declined. So the whales coming back feeds also the penguins. It feeds also the seals. And, honestly, very well managed in a precautionary way. Like, for example, we believe that a buffer around the South Orkney Islands, as South Georgia has done. South Georgia has put a no-take zone where in the summer and year-round there's a buffer such that no krill can be taken near shore to the islands in the area that we believe is most important for the marine life. That would be a really good idea here. And that's something that the world could do, honestly, quite quickly if we could, figure out how to govern in this space.
Yeah, and in fact, that's what's proposed by ASOC and also by Argentina and Chile, I think, in this CAMLA body, the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, which actually governs the fisheries. There is this proposal for a marine protected area in the area called Domain 1, which I think is where you're more or less currently in, right?
Yes,
so
yes.
So it's not as if there are no ideas out there for how to protect the ecosystem a bit more directly. And it doesn't necessarily mean shutting the entire krill fishery down. There's a lot more that needs to be done, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think I personally, do I think we should be fishing in the Antarctic? My personal opinion is no. However, I do think there is a way that, we can have our krill and eat it too, or whatever the correct analogy is here. And that's just really careful, cautionary management of the fishery. And some aspects of the fishery seem open to that. Perhaps not every nation, every vessel, but a lot of the krill fishing companies realize that their whole brand is that the krill they have is sustainable and it's pure and it's, clean, all this stuff, all these sort of buzzwords associated with responsible behavior of this very fragile ecosystem. And yet what we're seeing might not align with that. And I think as a result, they're probably getting nervous at the sense that, we're showing and we'll see if it's demonstrating based on the data, but showing and perhaps demonstrating how, the way they extract the krill in this ecosystem is perhaps not as sustainable and perhaps could be done in better ways. And I think what Ted mentioned is an obvious sort of compromise, which is to say we've identified the South Orkney Islands and, within, let's say, 50 kilometers, 30 kilometers of the shores of these islands as incredibly productive zones. We are currently, in the midst of the science, collecting the data to see if it supports something like a no-take zone around the South Orkneys, just like there is a no-take zone around South Georgia. And if it does, then I think that's an easy compromise that I hope the fishery would be open to, right? Because, I feel like, I don't know if I'd ever be a vocal supporter of the fishery, but, I don't necessarily, from my personal position, need to denigrate it either. If they're responsible actors, then there might be a way that, we can all coexist, even if it's not specifically something that I think we should be doing. But there are definitely ways to do this better. And I think that is really what the objection of ASOC, WWF, and We Planet and others are opposed to, is not necessarily the fishery as a whole, but rather the way the fishery is acting and just receiving, a blue check mark from MSC when it's just like, well, wait a minute, what exactly are we basing this on? And is this actually the Southern Ocean and the Antarctica that we want? And it's kind of fun also to be working with folks on all sides of the spectrum. Like, I'm not opposed to, and in fact, I would welcome collaboration with the fishery to think about solutions and compromises, but then also to be here on a Sea Shepherd boat where their clear directive is, no fishing in the Antarctic whatsoever. And I mean, that's, I think, a very strong position and one that I think would be hard to object to. But I'm a little bit more in the middle on that personally, but I'm just willing to see what the data suggests of how we can best conserve this place and the human activity that may or may not occur here. But it's been really fun to sort of see these different dimensions of, governance and policy and science and activism kind of all coming together because it's an issue, because it's a place that we all really passionately care about, Antarctica, and a place that we're set to lose if we don't treat it with the respect that it deserves.
Yeah, well, the krill fishing company Aker Krill, the Norwegian trawling firm, which takes 2/3 of the entire catch, claims to support the marine protected area in their communications, but behind the scenes, the Norwegian government in CAMLA, in this conservation body which regulates the whole thing, were apparently asking for a doubling of the krill take. So there's a lot of strange machinations going on behind closed doors. But Lucia, maybe if we can pass on to you, tell us about the specifics of the science that you're carrying out on the boat there. Because I know I was talking to Matt earlier a few days ago, and he was telling me that most of the research that has gone on in the past, simply due to funding constraints, has gone on krill fishing vessels. So here you are as an NGO, which has a conservation mandate, and so presumably you can focus very specifically on the science that you want to do. So tell us what that looks like on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, sure. This Matt might be better to answer, but I can start and then Matt can pick up. So yeah, as you are saying, the best thing we can offer is that independency from krill fishing vessels. Not only independency as in we have our ideas and we can carry them without really being pressured or living in the same space as the fishing vessel, which always makes research a bit trickier. But what we can have is this spatial independence. So we can observe and study the whales not only next to fishing vessels, but also in other areas. Something that we have been saying since the first year we came, that last year we really pushed for it, and this year we have these guys to try to scientifically show it, is how overlapped the whales and the krill fishing fleet are. For us, it's something that we have seen every time once we go next to the krill fishing fleet, there's going to be blows everywhere, whales everywhere. And then there's going to be a line in which the krill fishing vessels turn. So they do this pattern like back and forth to fish. Once we reach the line in which they're going to turn around, if we keep going in that direction, there is no whales to be seen. There is no wildlife to be seen. So we keep trying to prove this point of when we talk about this 1%, when we talk about the quotas, it doesn't work because they live exactly in really, really concentrated places. So what we try to do this year is, since we have the time, the space, and the science to study the areas in which the krill fishing fleet are not spending their time. Do we see the same amount of whales? Do the whales behave in the same way? Or is just krill fishing fleet happens in exactly the same point where whales feed and whales hang out? So this is what we're trying to do.
Just to add on to a little bit to Lucia's awesome answer there, you should say all the stuff is preliminary and anecdotal because we're still underway, and it'd be fun to come back in a couple months and talk in a more finalized way about what we've found. But I think one of the things that's been pretty inspiring to me, and I mean Ted might want to chime in here as well, is that we are seeing a lot of whale activity and wildlife activity of all sorts as we come upon the krill fishery, but also we've seen large groups of whales far from the krill fishery as well. So that gives us hope for the resilience and the integrity of this ecosystem, even in the face of increasing krill fishing pressure. Now, I could see, for example, an industry representative saying, well, if there's whales all over, including not just by the fishery, but also in other places, then there's probably enough krill for all, right? And I think what I would say to that is, and I've read this is why I could conceive of this being a point that would try to be made. But I go back to the bigger reason why we're here, which is to say that if we are in perhaps the most important whale feeding ground on Earth, shouldn't it be protected? Shouldn't we not have industrial extraction of whale food and penguin food in that area? Imagine running an ag combine through the Serengeti during the wildebeest migration, right? I mean, imagine clear cutting the Amazon rainforest, which we are doing and people are upset about, rightfully so. But here, something maybe not on the same scale or in a different way, but that type of behavior is happening here. And just because we see whales in other locations in this amazing region, not solely by the fishery, to me says, okay, this area is even of greater conservation importance than even I recognized. It's not just that we have whales and the fishery on top of each other, which we do have that, but we also have much bigger populations of whales and penguins and so on than we might have otherwise understood, which to me suggests that this area is in dire need of real conservation, like an international marine MPA. And like you said, I think, Norway and other folks have pushed for this MPA to pass. But I think it's important, Mark, to mention to your listeners that just because something is called a marine protected area, it depends on what the specifics of that protection are. There are a lot of marine protected areas, both in Antarctica and around the world, that allow fishing and allow industrial extraction. So just because something is labeled as an MPA, the devil is in the details, and we need to be really careful about when and how and where we're doing extraction in the oceans, regardless of what label we put on this ecosystem. But, it's a very, very special place and one that we want to see and the one that we want to have on our planet for decades and centuries to come, so that we can continue to know that this place exists on our planet. It's really an amazing space. So I don't know if that answered your questions, but we're really passionate about this project, obviously, and it's just been exceptional to be here with Sea Shepherd because we are the only group that is able to do a fisheries independent survey. What that means is the fishing boats, and they have scientists that Ted and I know, and we enjoy working with. I enjoy the science that they put out. But the thing that they can't do is tell us what's happening in the ecosystem not around the fishery. They can't do a fisheries independent survey of the region, which is exactly what we're doing here. We're trying to understand at a landscape scale, at a big scale, what's happening in different portions of this ecosystem. And yes, some of those portions, there is intense krill fishing, but many there aren't. And we want to have a bigger, more holistic picture to sort of promote this place on the global stage, to think of it in the same way we think of the Amazon rainforest, in the same way we think of the Serengeti. You could never do something like this in the Serengeti because it's the Serengeti. And this place, we think, should be on par with those locations as well.
So I don't know whether, Ted, this is for you, but what are you actually measuring and how are you going about it?
Yeah, this is Ted.
So I'm such the kid in the candy shop here, right? Yeah. And from a scientist's point of view, it's been a really special expedition. I didn't honestly, when Savoca first brought this up, I said, oh, that'd be nice. Honestly didn't believe it would happen because typically a voyage like this with a dedicated vessel, it'd be years of planning, fundraising, grant writing, so on and so forth. And this all really unfolded in the last few months, which led to a scramble and a very excited and happy one. And I think we're just delighted that things have come together. So what are we measuring? We're trying, honestly, to measure, kind of doing the everything we can, but particularly focused on a structured survey to be able to come away with an estimate of whale numbers, species, and where. And one of the most striking things that we got here, and I'd heard this time and again, especially from the captains of the last years of the Sea Shepherd campaign, when we approach the krill fissures, then we will see whales. And okay, that's interesting. But then to see it in person was caused us to start to shift our methodology a bit to be able to document a strong overlap of density between where we see the krill fissures and where we see the whales. Now, just as Matt mentioned, right, we've also had some big patches of whales away. So what we're trying to do is, in space and time, understand where the whales are and to, as best as we can, what they're doing. And that what they're doing is kind of a big open piece that we're inserting a few different techniques. So the big effort is surveying, where we're driving the ship in a planned route that's independent of either where we expect to see the whales or where we expect to see the krill fissures, but covering the broad area, right? And so we're on the bridge counting in a very specific way how far away, using special binoculars that measure the basically drop from the bridge, and then the angle from the ship, so that we can place each whale on a map and each whale sighting. It gets pretty exciting when we came across roughly 200 fin whales day before yesterday. The data recorders, you could see smoke coming off of their fingers and, changing out folks just because it was actually like, oh, okay, I've got a whale. I've got 3 whales here. I've got 4 whales at 30 degrees and so on and so forth.
How many times have you seen that in your 30-year career in Antarctica?
Well, now I've seen this twice, and both of them have been on this trip. It's really, that part is special. Yeah. Oh no, this is like nothing I've ever seen, really, honestly. I've seen 3 super aggregations of whales defined, in this case, say defining as 100 whales. One of them was in Monterey Bay, California 10 years ago. And then the other 2 have been in the last week here. I've seen many, many, many whales, and there's places on the Antarctic Peninsula where you can just get dozens and dozens of whales. But this concentration with this kind of active feeding, it's like, honestly, it's like going to that square in Taiwan, in Tokyo, where with every change of the lights, just there's a flood of people charging through. That's a bit how it feels among these whales. So to measure that, we're also flying drones over the animals to be able to assess their body condition. We can actually measure their length and width. Also observe behavior that way. We've seen some incredible, what we call echelon feeding, where multiple fin whales are gulping water at the same time or in immediate succession in order to kind of coordinate to get the best possible and most successful feeding. We are going out by small boat to take little genetic samples from whales where we can. And so with that, we can determine the sex of the individual. If female, we can determine if pregnant. This is working with a colleague at UC Santa Cruz, University of California, Santa Cruz, who in his PhD work, Logan Palin, he was able to link that pregnancy rates vary dramatically with humpback whales from as low as like 25% to as high as 80%, depending on ice conditions. So
How'd you get a genetic sample from a whale?
Isn't that fantastic? Yeah. So what we do is we actually bounce a little dart off of the back of the whale. It's a biopsy sample. So, right, your doctor says to you, oh, we have concerns. We need to, biopsy your liver. Kind of the same thing, except for we actually use a dart thrown by a crossbow. It bounces off the whale. It's probably a bit like a mosquito bite, or I think that the whales react sometimes, not always. The reaction is would seem to be more by surprise. We actually had a whale two days ago where I missed the shot. The dart went over the whale and hit the water behind the whale, and it reacted similarly. The splash and the noise of the splash was like, kind of similar reaction. So we're pretty confident it's minimally invasive. And so when we take this little bit of skin and a little bit of blubber, I freeze it, and then when we get it home, we can pull genetics out of the skin. We can pull estrogen concentration out of the blubber. We can pull various toxicology and hormones out of the blubber. Really, really fantastic quantity of information in just a tiny little package. We are also towing a hydrophone to listen to not just the baleen whales that we're seeing, right? These large filter feeding whales, but also toothed whales like killer whales, sperm whales, these rare beaked whales that are things you never see because they can spend a couple hours underwater for every 10 minutes on the surface. Let's see, what else? Oh, we have an echo sounder running so that we can map the prey concentrations, right? Where there's krill is where we see the whales. That's just anecdotal. No surprise, right? If you're hungry, you go to where the food is, not to open just empty water.
But you're not mapping the krill biomass concentration, because I've heard that the data for the actual abundance of krill and the spatial abundance as well, where the krill actually is and in what quantities, is also somewhat out of date, and that's a concern really with this sustainability certification. Matt, I don't know, or Lucia, whether you're better placed to address this, but what do we know about how much krill is actually out there, and therefore we can draw some conclusions about whether a human fishery could be sustained?
Yeah, I think we probably all have some knowledge and opinions on that. But I think what I want to highlight is the spatial mismatch between the surveys that have been done and the ecologically relevant scales for predators. So the fishing fleet, particularly the Norwegians, they take, huge sort of transects. They're running very fancy echo sounders, autonomous little boats in front of their boats, called krillmobiles. It's kind of amazing to see an autonomous sort of like robot boat that can lead their large catcher ships to the areas of highest krill density. But they publish a lot of that information and share it. And so we get to see sort of where they're finding the most krill over the years. But they're surveying a vast area, and what we're doing is we're surveying an area in much higher resolution at scales that matter to foraging predators, right? So when you think about these large numbers that, for example, the fishery uses or scientists use at really large scales, tens of millions of tons, 60 million tons, whatever, that's good to know. But what's most relevant to the animals is what is actually on their potential dinner plate for that night, right? Not all the food in the world, but rather what could potentially be a meal for them on that given day. And that's sort of more of the data that we're interested in, thinking about it from the whale's perspective rather than from a human exploitation perspective. And yeah, I mean, so again, if you're taking these big, broad surveys of a huge region, the region size of continental US or Europe, the data that the fishing fleet has taken and in some cases provided is quite good. I mean, there's no reason why I have to suspect that it's not being reported accurately, but it's not really what's most relevant to wildlife, right? So it depends on sort of what angle you're approaching this from. And similarly, there is this notion of like, well, if there's more krill in the ocean and a broad way, we can increase catch, right? We can increase more catch, we can catch more. But the issue is that we're going to actually just increase that catch on these specific places. We're not going to go increase catch and go elsewhere. We're going to increase catch in just this area, just the Antarctic Peninsula, because there's more krill all over the Scotia Sea. Like, how does that align? That doesn't really make sense to me anyway, at least from an ecological perspective. So Yeah, I think it's an issue that we're here to kind of shed more light on and observe in a higher resolution, one that matters more to the preservation of the ecosystem.
Well, on this podcast, we're about saving the world from bad ideas. I think we can probably all have a consensus that krill fishing in the Antarctic is a bad idea. So we can put that in our comms for this episode. And I wouldn't normally do this because I'm supposed to fundraise for We Planet, but I would encourage listeners and viewers to support Sea Shepherd because I think you're doing amazing work down there, both in terms of the straightforward awareness raising of this and also hosting an incredible scientific research expedition, which Matt and Ted and yourself are currently working on. So any final thoughts to leave us with?
Something very cool that we're doing this year, for example, is that we're sharing not only our results and what we're seeing, but also live on the ship in a web series. So your listeners, whoever they want, they can check on YouTube, Sea Shepherd. And once a week, we have like an episode of our results, our first encounter with the krill fishing fleet. We don't have to forget that Antarctica is really far, so it takes us a month to arrive to Antarctica and a month to go back to New Zealand because it's where the ship is based for their other campaigns. For us, what is really cool in Sea Shepherd is that we approach a lot of different problems with all the ships that we have and the crew that we have. So I would recommend everyone to just check our website, check our Instagram. We have this beautiful campaign, but we also do a lot of campaigns against illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing in West Africa, in the Pacific Islands. So it's really, really interesting, everything we can do when people donate their money, people donate their time and come and crew with us. If anyone is interested, there's always positions on board. So I would really recommend everyone to just check what we're doing. And I'm sure that there's going to be something that excites them.
Thanks so much. Matt and Ted, any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I mean, I think we just want to, I'll speak and then Ted can speak as well, but I think a lot of our thoughts will overlap here. I mean, we're humbled by this experience to be able to have this opportunity. And to say that no other scientists are having this opportunity is not a hyperbole. I don't think any other scientists besides those that are aboard krill fishing vessels are having this opportunity. So this is unique in the literal sense of the word. And, we're all very passionate about this idea. I'm not getting paid to do this. There's incredible in-kind support from Sea Shepherd and from other folks that have allowed us to be here without going broke. And that's very much appreciated. But I'm here out of a passion project, and one that I think is, if we have these scientific skills and this ability to add data and information to, support conservation, then that's what we're going to do. And so if you have, readers, but also listeners that think this work is foundational and important, and want to, contribute to more scientific expeditions in this region, I think that would be incredibly welcome. Because we'd love to come back and make this, a multi-year study where we can really start to answer questions
How do people do that? How do people find out how to support you?
Great question. Yeah, I mean, they could probably get in touch with me, Matt Savoca, or Ted Cheeseman, or Lucia Morillo on Sea Shepherd. And if you provide our contact information with the episode.
Yeah, we can we'll put it. That's a good idea. We'll put it in the show notes. Absolutely.
Yeah, please do. Because this is more or less a crowdfunded Sea Shepherd is a crowdfunded organization operating entirely on donations, and we want to continue to come back here as long as the fishing fleet is here, as long as we feel as though we don't know enough about this region to fully protect it. We would like to continue this type of work here. We think it's absolutely imperative for the conservation of one of the most special places on our planet. So, if folks are listening and are interested in supporting, please do get in touch with one or all three of us. We'd be very happy to have your support on vital work like this. So thanks so much, Mark, for having us on and giving us this platform to speak about the work. And I'll let Ted sign off now, but really do appreciate this time.
Thanks, Matt.
Cheers. Well, thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to chat with you and your listeners. Look, from my point of view, in the spirit of your podcast, Saving the World from Bad Ideas, these are not simple things because they're far away. It's not just, don't buy this. It's what really needs to happen here is coordinated public will to save these great places, right? And that's many things. That's insisting that our governments work together and that there's global collaboration and coordination. There's also many things like the downstream impacts of this. You mentioned salmon farming. That is where the majority of this krill goes, is into farming Atlantic salmon, which also has its own downstream impacts of coastal marine pollution. And to think about, do we want to take nutrients out of the Antarctic, put it into coastal waterways to feed invasive non-native fish? We've created quite a system to do that, and I think there's a lot more healthy food systems, quite frankly, just strictly for health, not even out of ecology, but for health. So yeah, thank you. It's a real treat to be here and to talk with you and all.
Well, thanks, Ted, and thanks, Matt and Lucia as well. It's really kind of you to spare time. I hope the storm abates soon. Good to get all three of you shot there in front of your porthole. And well, as I say, if the storm abates, you can get on with your science, I think. But for now, it's just I'm glad it's been stormy, because you've been able to spare more than an hour for me. So I think all of us have really benefited from hearing about what you're doing and just hearing the passion with which you're doing it. So thanks again for joining us and for helping to save the world from bad ideas.
Many thanks,
Thank
Mark.
you so much.
Pleasure. Cheers.
Thanks so much for listening to Saving the World from Bad Ideas, a We Planet podcast. We Planet's a movement of citizens and scientists dedicated to defending the science and solutions we need to save the world. Please do subscribe and share a nice review. It helps us spread the message. We'd also love to hear your feedback and suggestions at our email, podcast@weplanet.org. Please also join our podcast mailing list and we'll let you know when a new episode drops. Just go to savingtheworldfrombadideas.org or weplanet.org/podcast right now. See you next time.